History has a habit of appearing cleaner than it truly is. When we look back at the distant past, we often see beginnings that feel abrupt, civilizations that seem to arrive fully formed with complex social structures, advanced skills, and shared systems of meaning already in place. There is little sense of hesitation, experimentation, or gradual assembly. Instead, these societies appear in the historical record as if they had stepped into existence all at once. This impression has shaped the way modern audiences think about early civilization. We imagine long stretches of simplicity followed by sudden leaps forward, moments when humanity somehow crossed an invisible threshold and became civilized. Writing appears, cities emerge, architecture rises, and history, as we recognize it, begins. But this appearance may be deeply misleading. What we call a beginning in history is rarely the true start of anything. More often, it is simply the earliest point at which evidence survives. Archaeology does not uncover the past as it was lived. It uncovers what time has failed to erase. This distinction is subtle but critical. Materials decay at different rates. Cultural practices leave traces unevenly. Entire ways of life can vanish without leaving a single durable mark. What remains is not a neutral sample of the past, but a filtered one, shaped by chance, preservation, and the physical limits of matter. When we say that a civilization appeared suddenly, what we often mean is that it appeared suddenly to us. Consider how fragile most human activity truly is. Homes built from wood, earth, or plant fiber disappear within generations. Tools made from organic materials rarely survive. Knowledge transmitted orally leaves no direct imprint at all. Even social complexity, hierarchies, rituals, systems of authority can exist without producing objects that endure for thousands of years. If such societies flourished before adopting durable materials, they would be nearly invisible to us today. This creates a powerful illusion. We encounter a civilization at the moment it begins using stone, clay, or metal, and mistake that moment for its origin. Everything prior feels absent, and absence is easily confused with non-existence. The result is a historical narrative filled with apparent leaps. We see advanced construction techniques with no visible learning curve. We see organized settlements without clear evidence of earlier social experimentation. We see symbolic systems and shared beliefs without obvious developmental stages. And because the earlier layers are missing, the later ones appear anomalously complete. This does not mean that development was sudden. It means that development was selectively erased. Modern viewers often assume that if a process were gradual, we would see its stages clearly preserved in the ground. But this assumption misunderstands how preservation works. Archaeology is not a continuous recording. It is a collection of fragments that survived long enough to be discovered. Imagine reading a novel in which the first several chapters were missing. The story would not feel gradual. Characters would appear fully developed. Conflicts would already be in motion. The illusion of suddenness would be unavoidable, even though the missing chapters once existed. History may work the same way. What we call early civilization could already be the middle of a much longer story, a point at which societies had already experimented, failed, adapted, and refined their ways of living, long before they began leaving behind materials that could outlast millennia. If that is true, then the question changes. The mystery is no longer why these civilizations appear so advanced at their first appearance. The real mystery is how much of their earlier development lies permanently beyond our reach, and whether our idea of beginnings is built not on what truly started, but on what simply survived. There is another reason the past appears to begin so abruptly, and it has less to do with what ancient societies did and more to do with how modern minds organize time. We are conditioned to think in thresholds. We speak of before civilization and after civilization, as if humanity crossed a single definable line. We name periods, Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and treat them as clean divisions rather than overlapping transitions. These labels are useful, but they also simplify. They compress long, uneven processes into tidy categories that feel decisive. In reality, human development rarely obeys such boundaries. Change accumulates quietly. Practices spread unevenly. Knowledge advances in one place, stalls in another, and sometimes disappears entirely before re-emerging elsewhere. What looks like a sudden beginning may be nothing more than the moment when multiple slow-moving processes converged into something visible. From a distance, convergence looks like creation. Consider how long it takes for skills to mature without leaving physical traces. Architectural knowledge can exist long before monumental structures are built. Social hierarchies can develop without permanent dwellings. Symbolic systems can flourish without written language. These forms of complexity are real, but they are fragile. They travel lightly through time. Only when societies begin to anchor themselves through durable materials, fixed settlements, or permanent storage do they become visible to us. At that point, their accumulated knowledge enters the archaeological record all at once. To the modern observer, this can feel uncanny. It is as if a civilization appears already knowing what it is doing. Techniques seem refined, organization appears deliberate, cultural patterns feel established rather than experimental. But this may simply be the first moment when those patterns became difficult to erase. There is also a deeper discomfort at work here, one that is rarely acknowledged. The idea that civilizations emerge gradually reassures us. It suggests predictability, a sense that progress unfolds in steps we can trace, understand, and replicate. Sudden appearances challenge that comfort. They suggest that complexity can exist unseen, that long periods of human experience may leave no durable footprint, and that our confidence in the completeness of the historical record may be misplaced. For some, this raises unsettling questions. If entire phases of development can vanish so completely, how much of what we call history is really just a narrow slice of survival? How many sophisticated societies existed briefly, adapted intelligently, and disappeared without ever intersecting with the materials we know how to recognize? These are not speculative questions in the sense of fantasy. They arise directly from the limits of evidence. Archaeologists are careful to distinguish between absence of evidence and evidence of absence. Yet outside academic circles, that distinction often collapses. What we do not find is quietly assumed never to have existed. This assumption is understandable, but it carries consequences. It shapes our image of early humans as tentative, slow, and perpetually on the edge of ignorance. It frames technological skill as something that must always announce itself through stone and metal. And it reinforces the belief that without visible monuments, societies could not have been complex. But complexity does not require permanence. It requires coordination, memory, shared meaning, and adaptation, qualities that can exist independently of lasting materials. If such qualities developed early and did so in environments or traditions that favored impermanence, they may have left little behind for us to find. In that case, what we interpret as a sudden rise might instead be the moment when invisibility ended. This perspective does not deny progress, it reframes it. Development becomes less like a staircase and more like a landscape, full of rises, plateaus, dead ends, and regions we no longer have access to. Seen this way, the illusion of sudden beginnings is not a mystery to be solved, but a warning to be heeded. It reminds us that history is not a complete archive. It is a partial record shaped by survival, chance, and material endurance. And once we accept that, a more troubling possibility emerges. If beginnings are illusions created by preservation, then the neat evolutionary stories we tell about civilization may rest on missing foundations. The gaps are not anomalies to be ignored, they are structural features of the record itself. Which leads to a difficult question. If what appears sudden is merely what survived, how many civilizations are we mistaking for origins when they are, in fact, echoes of something older that left no trace? Much of what we believe about early civilization is shaped less by evidence than by expectation. From an early age, we are taught a particular story of human development. It is orderly, logical, comfortingly progressive. Humanity begins in simplicity, gradually improves its tools, refines its social structures, and eventually arrives at complex civilization. Each stage builds cleanly upon the last, leaving behind visible steps that confirm the sequence. This model feels intuitive. It mirrors how we imagine learning works: trial, error, improvement. And for modern societies accustomed to documented progress, it seems reasonable to assume the past unfolded the same way. But when archaeologists examine the material record closely, they encounter a recurring tension between what they expect to find and what actually appears. Instead of smooth transitions, they often find discontinuities. Instead of long chains of incremental improvement, they encounter abrupt shifts. Techniques emerge that appear unusually refined for their supposed place in the timeline. Social organization appears suddenly coherent. Symbolic systems arrive already structured. These moments are not rare exceptions. They are common enough to suggest a pattern. The problem is not that the linear model is entirely wrong. It is that it is incomplete. It assumes that development must always be visible, cumulative, and materially recorded. It presumes that complexity announces itself through durable artifacts at every stage. Yet history repeatedly resists that assumption. Consider how modern skills develop. Many forms of expertise leave little physical trace. Knowledge is practiced, transmitted, and refined long before it is ever formalized. By the time it becomes visible in permanent form, much of the experimentation has already taken place. The archaeological record captures the moment of formalization, not the full arc of learning. This distinction matters because it affects how we interpret early evidence. When a technique appears suddenly advanced, the instinctive reaction is surprise. How could people without visible precursors produce something so sophisticated? But this reaction depends on a hidden premise, that we would necessarily see those precursors if they existed. In reality, many early stages of development are unlikely to survive at all. Temporary structures, perishable tools, and informal social systems do not fossilize easily. They vanish quietly, leaving no contradiction behind. As a result, what survives can appear disproportionately advanced. There is also the issue of projection. Modern observers tend to map contemporary categories backward onto the past. We expect clear distinctions between hunter-gatherers and farmers, between nomadic and settled life, between simple and complex societies. These categories are analytically useful, but they can distort the past when treated as rigid stages. Human societies have always been more fluid than our labels suggest. Groups may adopt certain practices while rejecting others. They may experiment with permanence temporarily and then abandon it. They may develop sophisticated social coordination without centralized authority or monumental architecture. When such societies eventually intersect with materials that endure, stone foundations, fired clay, metal tools, they enter the historical record abruptly. But the practices themselves may be much older. What archaeology reveals then is not the first appearance of complexity, but the first appearance of durable complexity. This difference is subtle, but it carries profound implications. It suggests that what we call early civilizations may already represent late stages of longer, invisible processes. The refinement we observe is not evidence of sudden brilliance, but of accumulated experience that has finally become visible. This challenges the familiar story of linear ascent. Instead of a single universal path, development begins to look contingent, local, dependent on environment, materials, and cultural choice. Some societies leave long trails of evidence, others leave almost none, and the absence of those trails does not necessarily reflect an absence of sophistication. The discomfort arises when expectations collide with this reality. If the past does not progress in neat, observable steps, then the confidence we place in timelines becomes unstable. Dates remain useful, but they no longer represent beginnings in any meaningful sense. They mark points of visibility, not points of origin. This forces us to confront a deeper uncertainty. If our expectations shape what we think we should find, and the record only preserves what it can, then how often are we mistaking gaps for simplicity? How often are we assuming naivety where there may have been quiet competence? The more closely we compare expectation with evidence, the clearer the tension becomes. And once that tension is acknowledged, the linear model begins to strain. Not because it is entirely false, but because it demands a completeness that the past cannot provide. As the distance between expectation and evidence grows, a subtle shift occurs in how we interpret the past. What once appeared puzzling begins to feel structural. The gaps are no longer isolated problems to be explained away. They begin to look like a recurring feature of the historical record itself. One of the most striking manifestations of this pattern is the persistent absence of transitional stages. In theory, gradual development should leave behind gradual traces. If societies moved step by step from simple to complex, we would expect to find intermediate forms, half-developed techniques, tentative social arrangements, architectural experiments that reveal learning and progress. Yet these middle layers are often missing, not partially preserved, missing altogether. This absence has long been treated as an inconvenience, a problem to be solved with better excavation, improved dating methods, or future discoveries. But after decades of research across continents, the pattern remains stubbornly consistent. In many cases, the transitional record is thin or non-existent, even in regions that have been intensively studied. This forces a reconsideration of our assumptions. The expectation of visible transitions rests on the belief that all development leaves durable material evidence. But this belief is more cultural than empirical. It reflects a modern bias toward documentation, permanence, and accumulation. We live in a world that records itself obsessively. It is easy to forget that most human history did not. For much of the past, innovation was not designed to last beyond immediate use. Tools were replaced rather than preserved. Structures were rebuilt rather than maintained. Knowledge was stored in people, not objects. Under such conditions, development could proceed extensively without ever intersecting with the materials that archaeology depends upon. When transitions are missing, it may not be because they never occurred, but because they unfolded in ways that were inherently unpreservable. This realization alters the meaning of what we find. Instead of representing the full arc of progress, the archaeological record becomes a kind of threshold document, capturing moments when societies crossed into material durability. What lies before that threshold is not empty, but opaque, and opacity invites misinterpretation. When observers encounter a society that seems to appear with advanced capabilities and no visible preparation, the temptation is to search for extraordinary explanations. Perhaps knowledge was imported. Perhaps development accelerated unusually fast. Perhaps something external intervened. But these reactions often overlook a simpler explanation, that the preparatory phases existed, but not in a form we can easily recover. This is not speculation. It is a direct consequence of how preservation works. Organic materials decay. Lightweight structures collapse without trace. Landscapes shift. Rivers move. Entire settlements can be erased without leaving recognizable layers. Over long spans of time, even stone can disappear through erosion, reuse, or burial beyond reach. Under these conditions, expecting a complete developmental sequence is unrealistic. Yet the expectation persists, largely because it aligns with our preference for linear narratives. We want history to resemble instruction, a series of steps that can be followed and understood. Missing transitions disrupt that comfort. They suggest that the past operated according to rules we do not fully grasp. This discomfort often manifests as skepticism. When faced with advanced features appearing early, some conclude that the dating must be wrong. Others assume that complexity has been exaggerated. Still others treat such cases as anomalies rather than symptoms. But anomalies become patterns when they repeat across cultures and eras. Again and again, archaeologists encounter societies that seem to arrive already capable. And again, the same question arises. Where is the learning curve? Perhaps the more honest answer is that the learning curve is not missing. It is simply invisible. This possibility forces a deeper reconsideration of how we define progress. If development does not always leave a trail of permanent artifacts, then progress itself becomes harder to measure. Complexity can no longer be equated with monumentality. Advancement cannot be judged solely by what survives. Instead, progress becomes contextual. It adapts to environment, material availability, and cultural priorities. Some societies externalize their knowledge in stone and metal. Others internalize it in memory, practice, and social structure. Both are forms of sophistication. Only one is reliably visible thousands of years later. The danger lies in confusing visibility with importance. When we privilege what can be excavated, we risk mistaking absence for simplicity and survival for superiority. We begin to tell stories in which certain paths appear inevitable, while others vanish entirely. And once those stories harden, they shape how we interpret every new discovery. By the time evidence reaches us, it is already incomplete. Our expectations complete the picture, sometimes inaccurately. Which brings us to an unsettling realization. If what we actually find is consistently shaped by what can survive, then the past we reconstruct may be systematically skewed. Not accidentally, but structurally. And if that is true, then the question is no longer why transitional stages are missing. The question is how many entire modes of development have been filtered out before we ever had the chance to notice them. In archaeology, layers matter. Each layer of soil represents a moment in time, a record of activity, abandonment, rebuilding, or change. When development is gradual, these layers tend to accumulate in discernible sequences. Older forms give way to newer ones. Simpler tools are replaced by more refined versions. Structures evolve incrementally. The ground, in theory, becomes a timeline. But in many of the most consequential early civilizations, that timeline appears incomplete. Archaeologists encounter occupational layers that suggest a sudden leap from one mode of life to another. A site may show sparse or ambiguous activity for long periods, followed abruptly by evidence of complex construction, coordinated labor, and established social organization. The expected intermediate layers, the stages where techniques were tested and refined, are thin, scattered, or missing altogether. This absence is often described cautiously, using phrases like poorly understood or not yet identified. But the underlying issue is more direct. The physical record does not show the transitions we expect to see. And this raises a difficult question. If complexity takes time to develop, where is the evidence of that time? One response is to assume loss. Erosion, later construction, agricultural disturbance, or simple bad luck may have destroyed earlier layers. This certainly happens, but when the same pattern appears across different regions, climates, and excavation histories, loss alone becomes an incomplete explanation. Another response is to reinterpret the transition itself. Perhaps the problem is not that the layers are missing, but that we are looking for the wrong kinds of layers. We expect development to announce itself through increasingly elaborate material remains. But what if development often occurred in ways that left little stratigraphic footprint? Social coordination, for example, does not fossilize easily. Neither do systems of knowledge transmission, decision-making, or ritual practice. These elements can grow increasingly sophisticated without producing corresponding changes in architecture or tool assemblages. A society may spend generations refining how it organizes labor, resolves conflict, or distributes resources, all without leaving a clear material signal. When such a society eventually adopts durable construction methods, the organizational complexity appears suddenly in the archaeological record, even though it may have been long in the making. In this sense, missing layers may reflect a mismatch between process and preservation. There is also the possibility that development was not uniformly gradual. Some transitions may have been compressed in time, driven by environmental pressure, demographic change, or cultural convergence. When multiple conditions align, societies can reorganize rapidly. But rapid change does not mean unprepared change. Acceleration often builds on foundations laid quietly over long periods. Without those foundations being visible, acceleration looks like emergence. This ambiguity places archaeologists in a difficult position. They must infer processes from fragments, reconstructing sequences that may never be fully recoverable. The temptation, then, is to rely on models, theoretical frameworks that fill in the gaps. Models are useful. They provide coherence, but they also impose expectations. When the physical record fails to conform to those expectations, the discrepancy is often treated as a problem with the data rather than with the model. Missing layers are explained away, postponed, or sidelined until further evidence appears. Yet decades of excavation have not resolved the pattern. In site after site across multiple early civilizations, the same question resurfaces. Why does the record seem to skip steps? This question becomes more pointed when we consider how often the first appearance of complexity is already mature. Buildings are well-planned, tool production is standardized, artistic motifs are consistent. These are not the hallmarks of early experimentation. They suggest practices that have already stabilized. Stability, in turn, implies time. If time is required, but its traces are absent, then the absence itself demands explanation. One possibility is that transitional layers existed but were created in contexts that archaeology struggles to access. Temporary settlements, mobile camps, or landscapes that have since changed beyond recognition. Another is that early development occurred within cultural traditions that actively minimized material accumulation. In either case, the result is the same: a compressed archaeological narrative that exaggerates suddenness. This compression has consequences. It reinforces the idea that civilization emerges in dramatic leaps rather than through subtle distributed change. It privileges visible transformation over invisible preparation. And it encourages us to see early societies as either primitive or astonishingly advanced, with little room in between. But history rarely conforms to such binaries. The missing layers are not simply gaps in knowledge. They are signals, indicators that the processes we are trying to reconstruct did not always align with the materials we know how to read. And if that is true, then the absence of transitional layers is not an anomaly to be resolved, but a clue to how much of early human development took place beyond the reach of durable evidence. Which raises a deeper concern. If entire phases of social and technological maturation can pass without leaving recoverable layers, then the archaeological record may be telling a story that is systematically incomplete. Not by accident, but by design. The ground preserves what it can. Everything else disappears. To understand why transitional layers so often vanish, it helps to look more closely at what tends to survive and what does not. Archaeology privileges the durable by necessity. Stone, fired clay, and metal endure. Organic materials, lightweight structures, and ephemeral spaces do not. This basic imbalance quietly shapes everything we think we know about early development. Transitions are especially vulnerable to this imbalance. Periods of experimentation rarely produce monuments. Early stages of change are often provisional. Structures are temporary. Tools are adapted rather than standardized. Social arrangements remain flexible. These are precisely the conditions under which material traces are least likely to persist. By contrast, once practices stabilize, societies tend to invest more heavily in permanence. They build with materials meant to last. They repeat forms consistently. They formalize routines. Only then do their activities begin to accumulate visibly in the ground. The effect is deceptive. The archaeological record disproportionately captures endpoints, not beginnings. It preserves moments when uncertainty has already been resolved, when societies have committed to a particular way of organizing space, labor, and meaning. The long period of adjustment that preceded that commitment often leaves little behind. This helps explain why transitional layers are not merely thin, but often absent. Transitions are, by definition, unstable. They occur during moments when societies are adapting, not consolidating, and adaptation favors flexibility over durability. People build quickly, move often, reuse materials, and abandon sites without ceremonial closure. These behaviors are efficient for living, but disastrous for long-term preservation. There is also a psychological element at work. Humans do not usually mark transitions as they are happening. Change is recognized in hindsight. At the time, it feels incremental, provisional, even temporary. Few people believe they are living through a foundational moment. As a result, transitions are rarely commemorated in ways that would ensure their survival. Only later, when a new mode of life feels established, do societies begin to anchor it materially. This means that what we uncover as the first appearance of complexity is often the first moment when complexity became confident enough to leave a durable mark. Another factor complicates matters further: reuse. Early communities frequently built over earlier sites, repurposed materials, or erased traces of prior occupation through routine activity. What might appear as a sudden beginning can actually sit atop a long history that has been physically overwritten. In such cases, the absence of transitional layers is not evidence of absence, but evidence of continuity. Continuity so ordinary that it left no reason to preserve itself. Environmental forces amplify this effect. Flooding, erosion, shifting shorelines, and vegetation growth can remove or bury evidence selectively. Sites associated with early, flexible lifeways are often located in dynamic environments: riverbanks, coastlines, seasonal landscapes, precisely the places least likely to preserve long stratigraphic sequences. Over time, these environments erase their own histories. What remains tends to be what was built later, more solidly, and often further from ecological volatility. Again, the record tilts toward stability and away from transition. This selective survival has shaped modern interpretations in subtle ways. When archaeologists encounter a mature system without visible precursors, the language of sudden emergence becomes tempting. It offers clarity. It fits the evidence at hand. But it also risks mistaking a preservational boundary for a historical one. The danger is not merely academic. Once we accept sudden emergence as a real phenomenon, we begin to look for causes that match its apparent drama. We search for rapid innovations, external influences, or singular breakthroughs. We downplay slow cultural accumulation and invisible learning. In doing so, we reinforce a distorted image of early societies, either as incapable until a moment of brilliance, or as recipients of knowledge from elsewhere. Both interpretations overlook a quieter possibility: that much of early development was never meant to be permanent. If societies were adaptive rather than accumulative, their success may have depended on precisely those qualities that archaeology struggles to detect. Flexibility, mobility, oral knowledge, and social memory are effective ways to live, but poor ways to be remembered. From this perspective, missing transitional layers are not failures of the record. They are expressions of how people once chose to exist. The ground preserves what was anchored. Everything else passes through time lightly. Recognizing this does not solve the mystery of sudden beginnings. It deepens it. It suggests that what we see as abrupt may actually be the visible edge of something much broader and older, a process that unfolded largely beyond the reach of durable matter. And once that possibility is taken seriously, the archaeological record begins to look less like a complete story and more like a series of silhouettes, sharp where material endured, blurred where it did not. Which leads to an unsettling conclusion. If transitions are the most vulnerable moments in history, then the most important phases of early human development may be precisely the ones we are least likely ever to recover. Time is not an impartial witness. It does not preserve the past evenly, nor does it record events according to their importance. It preserves selectively, guided by physical laws rather than human significance. What survives across millennia does so not because it mattered more, but because it endured longer. This simple fact underlies one of the most persistent distortions in how we understand early civilization. When we look backward, we are not seeing the past as it was lived. We are seeing the past as it was filtered by time. And time has preferences. Stone resists decay. Fired clay hardens. Metal corrodes slowly. Organic materials, wood, fiber, leather, plant matter, do not. They decompose, burn, rot, or are consumed. In most environments, they vanish quickly. Yet for most of human history, organic materials were dominant. Homes were built from wood, reeds, earth, and animal products. Tools were fashioned from bone, sinew, and plant fiber. Clothing, containers, and symbolic objects relied on materials never meant to last centuries, let alone thousands of years. From the perspective of deep time, entire worlds were disposable. This creates a profound asymmetry in the historical record. Societies that invested heavily in durable materials left behind visible traces. Societies that did not, regardless of their sophistication, faded quietly. Preservation, then, is not a measure of advancement. It is a measure of material choice. This distinction is often overlooked. We tend to associate durability with progress, permanence with importance. But these associations reflect modern values more than ancient realities. For many early societies, building to last indefinitely was neither practical nor desirable. Mobility, adaptability, and responsiveness to environment were often more valuable than permanence. In such contexts, longevity was a liability. Structures designed to endure can anchor a society to a place even when conditions change. Lightweight construction allows for flexibility. Oral knowledge adapts more readily than written codes. Social memory can evolve without leaving fixed records that constrain future generations. From this perspective, impermanence is not a flaw. It is a strategy. But strategies that prioritize impermanence leave little behind for archaeology to recover. As a result, when preservation fails, interpretation suffers. We fill the silence with assumptions. We equate what is missing with what was never there. Over time, these assumptions harden into narratives. The past begins to look simpler than it was. This distortion becomes especially pronounced when we attempt to reconstruct origins. The earliest phases of development are often the least materially durable. Experimental structures, provisional tools, and informal social systems do not survive long enough to become evidence. What remains are the later stages, more stable, more standardized, and more visible. To the modern observer, these stages appear foundational, but they may be anything but. What we call the beginning of a civilization may simply be the point at which it crossed a material threshold, adopting construction methods, storage practices, or symbolic objects that happened to resist decay. Everything prior becomes archaeologically invisible, regardless of how long it lasted or how complex it was. This creates a misleading sense of abruptness. The illusion is reinforced by how we date the past. Radiocarbon samples, stratigraphy, and artifact typologies provide timelines, but those timelines are anchored to what can be measured. When early phases leave few measurable traces, they are compressed or excluded entirely. The absence becomes structural. Over time, this structural absence shapes interpretation. Civilizations appear to arrive suddenly, not because they did, but because the processes that shaped them unfolded in materials time does not respect. This realization has consequences for how we read the record. If preservation governs visibility, then visibility cannot be equated with importance. A society's archaeological footprint reflects not only what it achieved, but how it chose to exist within its environment. Some societies externalized their knowledge in durable forms. Others embodied it in practices, relationships, and memory. Only the former are reliably legible thousands of years later. Yet, modern narratives privilege the legible. The danger is subtle. When we repeatedly encounter advanced features without visible preparation, we begin to imagine extraordinary explanations. We speak of sudden breakthroughs, radical innovations, or improbable accelerations. We marvel at how quickly complexity seems to arise. But what we are often witnessing is not speed, but survival. The past that reaches us has already passed through a severe filter. What remains is skewed toward the durable, the monumental, and the materially dense. Everything else has been quietly removed. This does not mean that archaeology is flawed. It means that archaeology is bounded. Its evidence is real but incomplete. Its silences are not empty. They are crowded with things that did not endure. Understanding this does not eliminate the mystery of sudden beginnings. It reframes it. The question shifts from why did civilization emerge so fully formed to something more difficult. How much of early human development was never designed to survive long enough for us to find it? Some aspects of human life are almost perfectly designed to disappear. They are essential, sophisticated, and culturally dense, yet materially fragile. Over long spans of time, these elements fade so completely that their absence is easily mistaken for non-existence. Understanding what time erases most efficiently is crucial to understanding why the past appears so incomplete. Among the most vulnerable are systems of knowledge that rely on people rather than objects. Oral traditions, for example, can preserve complex information with remarkable accuracy. Navigation, ecology, law, genealogy, cosmology, all can be transmitted without writing. But oral systems leave no direct trace once the people who carried them are gone. Their disappearance is total. Archaeology can sometimes infer their existence indirectly, but inference is not evidence. Without material anchors, such systems vanish from the record almost without resistance. The same is true of social organization. Leadership structures, systems of obligation, conflict resolution mechanisms, and shared norms rarely fossilize. They shape daily life profoundly, yet they do so without necessarily producing durable artifacts. A society may be highly coordinated, deeply stratified, and culturally complex, while leaving behind little more than scattered debris. In such cases, the archaeological footprint understates the social reality. Ritual is another casualty of time. Ritual activity often involves movement, sound, performance, and temporary installations. Sacred spaces may be marked symbolically rather than architecturally. Objects used in ceremonies are frequently organic, reused, or intentionally destroyed. The meaning lies in the act, not the residue. When rituals disappear, what remains may look mundane: hearths, pits, open spaces, stripped of the significance they once held. Without context, the extraordinary becomes ordinary. Even technological sophistication can vanish under the right conditions. Early tools made from wood, bone, or plant fiber were often highly specialized. They required skill, experimentation, and intimate environmental knowledge. Yet these tools decompose rapidly. Stone versions may survive, but they represent only a fraction of the technological landscape. The result is a skewed picture of capability. We see what was made to endure, not what was most frequently used. We assume that stone tools define technological limits, when in reality they may have been supplemental to a much broader toolkit that left no trace. This bias extends to architecture. Temporary structures, shelters, meeting spaces, storage facilities, were common in many early societies. Built for function rather than permanence, they could be dismantled, relocated, or allowed to decay. Their absence in the record does not imply architectural simplicity, only architectural impermanence. Yet modern observers tend to equate architecture with monumentality. We associate complex societies with large buildings, planned layouts, and durable construction. When these are missing, we infer social simplicity. But this inference confuses visibility with complexity. Some societies deliberately avoided permanent architecture. Others cycled through locations seasonally. Still others rebuilt regularly, leaving no stable footprint. In each case, preservation fails not because nothing was built, but because what was built was never meant to last. Time also erases failure more efficiently than success. Experiments that did not endure, social arrangements that collapsed, technologies that were abandoned, settlements that were short-lived, leave fewer traces than those that persisted. Over thousands of years, history becomes biased toward what worked longest, not what existed most fully. This creates a retrospective illusion of inevitability. Surviving systems appear dominant. Lost alternatives vanish from consideration. The past begins to look like a straight line leading to the present, when in reality it was filled with branching paths, many of which ended quietly. Preservation then does more than erase objects. It reshapes narratives. By filtering out the ephemeral, time elevates permanence into a proxy for importance. It encourages us to tell stories centered on stone, metal, and writing, not because these were the only foundations of civilization, but because they are what remain. This has subtle consequences for how we think about early societies. We come to associate intelligence with inscription, coordination with architecture, and advancement with accumulation. Societies that prioritized other values, adaptability, resilience, balance with environment, become harder to recognize. Their sophistication dissolves into absence. Once this is acknowledged, the mystery of sudden beginnings takes on a different character. It no longer suggests that civilizations emerged without preparation. It suggests that preparation itself often took forms that time refuses to preserve. The record we inherit is not neutral. It is curated by decay. What survives does so not because it was central, but because it resisted disappearance. And what disappears may include precisely those elements that made early societies function, adapt, and endure in their own contexts. This understanding does not restore what is lost, but it changes how we read what remains. Instead of asking why early civilizations appear so complete, we are forced to ask something more unsettling. How much of what truly mattered was never meant to last long enough to be remembered? For much of modern history, civilization has been imagined as something built. Stone walls, temples, roads, cities that announce themselves across centuries. These structures feel reassuringly solid, not only in material form but in meaning. They suggest permanence, coordination, and power. When we encounter them, we recognize civilization immediately. When we do not, we hesitate. This hesitation reveals an assumption so deeply ingrained that it often goes unexamined, that complex societies must leave behind large, durable constructions in order to be considered truly civilized. Yet this assumption is historically narrow. For most of human existence, building in stone was neither common nor necessary. It required specific resources, specialized labor, and a willingness to invest heavily in permanence. Many societies had neither the incentive nor the desire to do so. Stone architecture is not a universal marker of complexity. It is a cultural choice. In environments where resources shifted seasonally, permanence could be a disadvantage. Fixed structures tether people to locations that may no longer be viable. Floodplains change. Forests move. Coastlines retreat. In such contexts, flexibility is not a sign of primitiveness, but of intelligence. Societies that relied on lighter materials, wood, earth, reeds, animal products, could adapt quickly. They could dismantle, relocate, and rebuild with minimal cost. Their settlements were dynamic rather than fixed, responding to ecological rhythms rather than resisting them. From the perspective of deep time, however, these choices are punishing. Wood rots, earth erodes, organic materials vanish. What remains centuries later is often indistinguishable from natural processes. The absence of stone becomes the absence of evidence, and so these societies slip quietly out of history. This disappearance has shaped our collective imagination. Because monumental architecture survives, it becomes synonymous with civilization itself. Because flexible societies leave little behind, they are relegated to the margins, described as transient, simple, or undeveloped. But complexity does not require stone. A society can coordinate large populations, manage resources, transmit sophisticated knowledge, and sustain intricate social relationships without ever producing a monument. These achievements depend on communication, trust, memory, and shared norms, none of which fossilize easily. Indeed, some of the most demanding forms of social organization may be harder to maintain without physical anchors. When authority is not embedded in buildings or inscriptions, it must be continually reinforced through relationships and practice. This requires constant negotiation, attention, and cultural reinforcement. Such systems are fragile in one sense, but resilient in another. They adapt quickly. They evolve without needing to rebuild foundations. They leave few traces, but not because they lacked structure. The problem arises when modern observers equate absence of architecture with absence of organization. We imagine early societies as either nomadic and simple or settled and complex, as if these categories were mutually exclusive. But many societies occupied the space between. They were semi-mobile, seasonally settled, organizationally sophisticated, without being materially dense. When these societies disappear from the record, they leave behind a distorted picture. Civilization appears to emerge only where stone appears. Complexity seems to follow architecture rather than precede it, and the vast range of social forms that did not prioritize permanence becomes invisible. This distortion has consequences. It reinforces the idea that history advances toward monumentality, that permanence is progress, that what lasts longest matters most. Yet this is a retrospective judgment, not a historical one. For many societies, success was measured not by how long structures stood, but by how well people lived within their environments. Balance, sustainability, and continuity mattered more than endurance. From that perspective, a society without stone may have been highly successful, even if it left nothing behind for us to admire. The archaeological record, however, is unforgiving. It rewards accumulation. It preserves what resists time, and it marginalizes what does not. Over thousands of years, this bias compounds. Entire ways of life vanish from view, not because they were insignificant, but because they were ephemeral by design. When we encounter a civilization that appears suddenly with monumental architecture, we are tempted to treat it as a beginning, but it may instead represent a turning point, a moment when a society chose permanence over flexibility, visibility over adaptability. Everything prior becomes difficult to see. The danger lies in mistaking that choice for origin. If we assume that civilization begins with stone, we automatically exclude all forms of complexity that came before, or alongside, but did not announce themselves in ways time could preserve. And once those forms are excluded, the past appears narrower, simpler, and more linear than it truly was, which leads to an uncomfortable realization. If civilization can exist without stone, then the absence of monuments tells us very little about what a society knew, how it organized itself, or how long it had been developing before it crossed the threshold of permanence. If stone is not a prerequisite for civilization, then its presence requires explanation. Why do some societies eventually choose permanence? Why do they invest enormous effort in construction meant to endure beyond individual lifetimes? And why does this shift so often appear in hindsight, as the moment civilization begins? Monument building is rarely the first act of a complex society. It is more often a declaration. Before a society commits to stone, it must already possess the organizational capacity to do so. Large-scale construction requires planning, labor coordination, resource allocation, and shared purpose. These capabilities do not emerge spontaneously. They are the result of long social development. Stone architecture, then, is not evidence of complexity appearing. It is evidence of complexity stabilizing. This distinction matters. A society that builds monuments is announcing something about itself. It is signaling permanence, authority, continuity. It is asserting control over space and time. Such declarations are not necessary in all contexts. They become important when societies seek to formalize hierarchy, centralize power, or project identity across generations. In this sense, stone marks a shift in priorities rather than a beginning. The decision to build in durable materials often coincides with changes in social structure. Leadership becomes more fixed. Roles become more defined. Knowledge becomes externalized in symbols, layouts, and inscriptions. Memory moves from people into objects. This is not an inevitable progression. It is a choice. Some societies never make that choice. Others make it briefly and abandon it. Still others adopt permanence unevenly, combining monumental centers with flexible peripheries. The archaeological record, however, favors those that commit most fully. Once monuments exist, they anchor interpretation. They draw attention. They invite excavation. They shape narratives. A society with stone structures is more likely to be studied, preserved, and remembered. Its absence becomes less imaginable, its origins more heavily scrutinized. By contrast, societies without stone are easy to overlook. Their remains blend into landscapes. Their stories require inference rather than observation. Over time, they become footnotes, if they are acknowledged at all. This imbalance reinforces a particular view of history. Civilization begins when people settle. It matures when they build. It proves itself when structures endure. Everything before that is treated as preparation. But this view reverses causality. Settling and building are outcomes of social decisions, not prerequisites for intelligence or organization. They reflect conditions under which permanence becomes advantageous: environmental stability, surplus production, concentrated populations, or political centralization. When those conditions are absent, flexibility may be the more rational strategy. From this perspective, the societies we most easily recognize archaeologically may represent a subset of human development, those that chose visibility over adaptability. Their success is not universal, it is contextual. Yet because they leave the strongest traces, They dominate our understanding of the past. This dominance shapes expectations. When we look for civilization, we look for stone. When we do not find it, we assume absence. And when stone appears suddenly, we interpret it as an origin rather than a transition. The illusion of sudden beginnings persists because monumentality creates sharp boundaries in the record. Before stone, the past looks sparse. After stone, it looks dense. The contrast is dramatic but misleading. It reflects a change in material expression, not necessarily a change in underlying complexity. Recognizing this requires restraint. It requires resisting the impulse to treat visibility as significance. It requires acknowledging that some of the most complex social systems may have left the fewest durable traces. And it requires accepting that our picture of early civilization is shaped as much by material survival as by historical reality. Once this is accepted, the narrative shifts. Instead of asking why civilization seems to appear fully formed, we begin to ask why it becomes visible at certain moments and not others. Instead of searching for missing brilliance, we search for missing perspectives. And stone, once treated as a starting point, becomes something else entirely. A signal that a society has reached a stage where it wants to be remembered. That desire is telling. It suggests confidence, stability, and a sense of future. It also suggests that much has already been accomplished. Societies do not build for eternity until they believe they have something worth preserving. What came before may not have lacked complexity. It may simply have lacked the need for permanence. And that possibility forces a reconsideration of what we mean when we say civilization begins. Perhaps what begins is not civilization itself, but our ability to see it. Modern imagination binds knowledge tightly to cities. We associate learning with libraries, universities, archives, and institutions housed within dense urban spaces. We assume that intellectual complexity requires permanent centers, places where information can accumulate, be recorded, and be transmitted across generations. From this perspective, cities appear not only as economic hubs, but as engines of thought itself. This assumption feels natural, but it is historically recent. For most of human history, knowledge did not live in buildings. It lived in people. Before writing, before archives, before fixed institutions, information was embedded in practice. Skills were learned through repetition. Environmental understanding was carried in memory. Social rules were reinforced through ritual and custom. Knowledge was not separated from daily life, it was inseparable from it. Such systems can be remarkably sophisticated. Oral cultures have demonstrated the ability to preserve vast bodies of information with precision. Genealogies spanning centuries, ecological patterns tied to subtle environmental cues, navigational knowledge that spans oceans. These forms of intelligence do not require cities. They require continuity, attention, and shared responsibility. Yet because they leave few durable traces, they are easy to underestimate. When historians look for knowledge, they often look for its containers, written texts, educational buildings, urban layouts designed for administration and control. In their absence, they infer absence of complexity. But this inference reflects a bias toward externalized knowledge. Cities excel at storing information outside the human body. Records accumulate, decisions are documented, authority becomes fixed in texts and structures. This makes knowledge easier to scale, but it also changes its nature. Externalization trades flexibility for permanence. Once knowledge is written, it becomes stable but less adaptable. Once authority is embedded in institutions, it becomes consistent but less responsive. Cities amplify power and memory, but they also impose rigidity. For some societies, this trade-off is advantageous. For others, it is not. In environments that change rapidly or where populations move frequently, externalized systems can be a liability. Written records become outdated. Fixed institutions lose relevance. Centralized control struggles to adapt. In such contexts, embodied knowledge may be superior. This does not mean that non-urban societies lacked abstraction or theory. It means that their abstractions were encoded differently, in stories, practices, and social roles rather than in texts. Knowledge was distributed rather than centralized, dynamic rather than fixed. From an archaeological perspective, this is a problem. Cities leave traces. Knowledge embodied in people does not. As a result, the emergence of cities often appears as the emergence of intelligence itself. When urban centers appear in the record, they seem to arrive with administrative systems, specialized labor, and shared symbolic frameworks already in place. But these systems rarely originate with the city. They are imported into it. Urbanization tends to formalize existing knowledge rather than create it from nothing. Administrative practices codify relationships that were previously managed informally. Specialized roles institutionalize skills that already existed. Written records capture decisions that were once remembered collectively. Seen this way, cities are not the birthplace of knowledge. They are a method of preserving and amplifying it. This reframing alters how we interpret early urban centers. Instead of viewing them as sudden leaps in human capability, we can view them as crystallization points, moments when dispersed intelligence condensed into durable form. The condensation creates visibility. To the modern observer, this visibility can feel like novelty. Systems appear fully formed, hierarchies seem established, knowledge appears organized and authoritative. The absence of earlier material evidence reinforces the illusion of sudden emergence. But what is emerging may not be intelligence, but infrastructure. The distinction matters because it challenges a central assumption that without cities, societies could not sustain advanced knowledge systems. In reality, cities are one solution among many. They are particularly effective at managing large populations and long-term accumulation, but they are not required for complexity, nor are they inevitable. They reflect a convergence of environmental, social, and political conditions, not a universal endpoint. When we equate cities with knowledge, we risk overlooking vast domains of human intelligence that operated outside urban frameworks. We also risk misinterpreting the past by treating urbanization as a cognitive breakthrough rather than a logistical one. This misinterpretation feeds back into the mystery of sudden beginnings. If we assume that knowledge requires cities, then the appearance of cities must explain the appearance of knowledge. But if knowledge predates cities, and there is strong reason to believe it often did, then cities mark a transition in how knowledge is expressed, not when it is acquired. What looks like a beginning may actually be a translation. The question then becomes not why intelligence appears suddenly with urbanization, but why certain societies chose to fix what had previously remained fluid. And once that question is asked, the relationship between knowledge and visibility begins to shift in unexpected ways. Knowledge that lives outside cities faces a particular danger. It disappears all at once. When information is stored in buildings, texts, and institutions, it degrades slowly. Archives can burn, libraries can decay, but fragments often survive. Loss is partial. Reconstruction, however limited, remains possible. When knowledge is stored in people, the situation is different. Embodied knowledge depends on continuity. It survives only as long as the social fabric that carries it remains intact. Disruption, through migration, environmental collapse, disease, or violence, can erase entire intellectual systems within a generation. There are no ruins to excavate, no inscriptions to translate, no silent walls hinting at what once was. The disappearance is absolute. This vulnerability has shaped the historical record more than we often realize. entire bodies of understanding. Ecological management, navigation, astronomy, medicine, social law may have flourished for centuries without ever intersecting with durable media. When the societies that carried them dissolved, their knowledge dissolved with them. From the perspective of archaeology, it is as if nothing had been there at all. This creates a powerful illusion. The emergence of cities, writing, and formal institutions appears to coincide with the emergence of knowledge itself. But this coincidence is not causal. It is preservational. Cities do not create intelligence. They protect it from time. Once knowledge is externalized, written down, encoded in architecture, formalized in institutions, it becomes legible across centuries. But legibility should not be confused with origin. What survives longest is not necessarily what developed first. This distinction is often blurred in popular narratives. We tend to imagine early humans accumulating knowledge only after settling, only after building, only after inventing writing. Before that, we imagine a cognitive void, instinct rather than insight, survival rather than understanding. Yet ethnographic and historical evidence challenges this view. Non-urban societies have demonstrated remarkable precision in managing complex systems without written records. Agricultural cycles, seasonal migrations, resource distribution, and intergroup diplomacy were often coordinated through memory, ritual, and oral transmission. These systems were not simplistic. They were adapted to specific environments with a sophistication that often exceeds modern expectations. But when these systems vanished, they left no blueprint behind. This absence has consequences for interpretation. Because archaeology relies on durable traces, it tends to privilege societies that externalized knowledge. The more a society wrote, built, and stored, the more visible it becomes to later observers. Societies that relied on memory and practice become marginal, regardless of their actual complexity. Over time, this bias compounds. The historical narrative becomes centered on cities, texts, and monuments. Knowledge becomes something that emerges alongside bureaucracy. Intelligence becomes synonymous with inscription. Everything else fades into prehistory. This framing influences how we interpret sudden appearances. When a city enters the record with advanced planning, administration, and symbolic order, it feels unprecedented. We treat it as a cognitive leap, but it may simply represent the moment when a society chose to anchor its existing knowledge in forms that endure. In that case, what looks like emergence is actually exposure. The knowledge was already there. It had simply been moving through time in a form we cannot easily detect. This possibility complicates our sense of scale. If embodied knowledge can persist for long periods without leaving durable traces, then the intellectual history of humanity may extend far beyond what the archaeological record reveals. Long phases of development may be compressed into moments of visibility, making progress appear faster and more dramatic than it truly was. The compression distorts causality. Cities appear to cause complexity when in fact they may respond to it. Writing appears to create order when it may merely formalize relationships that already existed. Institutions appear to generate authority when they may simply stabilize patterns long negotiated informally. Once this inversion is recognized, the mystery of sudden beginnings becomes less about improbability and more about translation. Civilizations do not necessarily spring into being with full knowledge intact. They become visible when knowledge is transformed into durable form. But this transformation is selective. Only certain kinds of knowledge lend themselves to externalization. Administrative rules, property relations, calendars, and religious doctrines adapt well to writing and architecture. Other forms, situational awareness, improvisational skill, embodied expertise, resist fixation. As a result, what survives may not reflect what mattered most. This imbalance shapes our understanding of early societies. We reconstruct their priorities based on what they left behind, not on what they practiced daily. We assume that what was written was central, and what was unwritten was marginal. Yet the opposite may often have been true. For societies without cities, knowledge was not a static archive. It was a living process. Its disappearance does not indicate failure or simplicity. It indicates a mode of existence that did not align with the mechanisms of long-term preservation. And once that mode vanished, it left little behind to contradict the stories we tell in its absence. This does not mean we can recover what is lost, but it does mean we should be cautious about equating visibility with intelligence. The past may have been far more knowledgeable than it appears. It simply did not store its knowledge in ways designed to survive us. We tend to imagine development as something that accumulates. Progress, in the modern sense, leaves behind layers, improved tools, expanded infrastructure, increasing material output. Each generation builds upon the remnants of the last. The result is a visible trajectory, a path that can be traced backward through objects and structures. But this model reflects a particular way of living, not a universal rule. For much of human history, development did not always accumulate. In many cases, it circulated. Knowledge was refined, transmitted, and adapted without being fixed in permanent form. Skills improved, but tools were replaced rather than preserved. Social systems evolved, but institutions remained fluid. Progress occurred, but it did not necessarily leave behind a growing material footprint. From the perspective of archaeology, this creates a paradox. A society may develop extensively, intellectually, socially, technologically, and yet leave behind almost nothing that registers as advancement in the ground. Its development passes through time lightly, carried forward in behavior rather than in artifacts. When such a society disappears, its progress disappears with it. This challenges one of our most deeply held assumptions, that development is visible. In reality, visibility is conditional. It depends on whether development intersects with materials and practices that resist decay. When it does not, development can be effectively erased. This erasure is not random. Certain kinds of advancement are especially prone to leaving no trace. Adaptive knowledge is one example. Societies that thrive in variable environments often prioritize responsiveness over permanence. Their success depends on reading subtle cues, weather patterns, animal behavior, seasonal changes, and adjusting accordingly. These skills are refined over time, but they do not accumulate materially. Each generation learns the minutiae through experience. The ground records none of this. Another example is social innovation. Systems of cooperation, conflict resolution, and shared responsibility can become highly sophisticated without producing distinct artifacts. A society may develop complex norms governing marriage, trade, inheritance, or leadership without ever formalizing them in written codes or durable symbols. These innovations shape daily life profoundly, yet they leave little behind once the society dissolves. Even technological progress can evade preservation. Tools made from perishable materials can become increasingly efficient without changing in ways that survive archaeologically. Improvements in design, technique, and usage may be invisible in the fragmentary remains that endure. What looks static in the record may have been dynamic in practice. The result is a misleading stillness. When we examine the past through surviving artifacts alone, development appears episodic rather than continuous. Long periods seem stagnant, followed by sudden bursts of advancement. In reality, the bursts may reflect moments when invisible development crossed into visible form. This creates the illusion of acceleration. We see a civilization leap forward because we are witnessing the moment when cumulative, unrecorded progress finally intersects with durable expression. The leap feels dramatic because the preparation is hidden. Over time, this pattern reshapes how we think about progress itself. We begin to equate advancement with permanence. We assume that what does not endure did not matter. We privilege accumulation over adaptation, stability over flexibility. But these values are not timeless. They reflect a particular historical trajectory, one that favors storage, inscription, and monumentality. Other trajectories existed. Some societies developed by optimizing relationships rather than objects. Others prioritized balance over expansion. Still others valued continuity of practice over accumulation of material surplus. Their progress was real, but it was not cumulative in the way modern observers expect. When these societies vanished, they left behind a distorted silence. The silence tempts us to fill it with assumptions. We imagine simplicity where there may have been refinement. We assume stasis where there may have been ongoing change. We treat invisibility as evidence of absence. But invisibility may simply reflect a different relationship with time. If development does not anchor itself in durable matter, it becomes vulnerable to erasure. Entire trajectories of progress can vanish without contradiction. What remains is a selective record, one that overrepresents certain forms of advancement and underrepresents others. This selectivity matters because it shapes the story we tell about human potential. We come to believe that civilization requires accumulation, that intelligence requires inscription, that progress must be visible to be real. Societies that do not conform to these expectations are relegated to the margins of history. Yet when we encounter civilizations that appear fully formed, we are forced to confront the limits of this story. Their sudden visibility may not signal sudden development. It may signal the moment when a previously invisible trajectory briefly touched something that time could not erase. This possibility unsettles the linear narrative. It suggests that progress is not a single path, but a set of strategies, some of which leave traces and some of which do not. The absence of trace does not imply absence of development. It implies a form of development that history is poorly equipped to remember. And once that is acknowledged, the archaeological record begins to look less like a timeline of advancement and more like a narrow window, revealing only those forms of progress that chose, or happened, to endure. When development leaves no trace, time becomes misleading. Archaeological timelines are built from what can be dated: artifacts, structures, layers of occupation. These anchors give history its apparent structure. They allow us to say when something happened, even if we are uncertain about how or why. But when large portions of development produce no durable evidence, timelines begin to compress. Long processes collapse into short spans. Gradual change appears abrupt. What may have unfolded over centuries can seem to occur within a few generations, not because it did, but because only its final expression survived. This compression alters perception. A civilization appears to rise rapidly. Its institutions seem to cohere instantly. Its technical skill looks improbably refined for its supposed age. Observers speak of sudden breakthroughs, revolutionary moments, or unexplained leaps forward. But what we may be witnessing is not speed. It is visibility. The timeline marks the point at which development intersects with preservation, not the point at which development begins. Everything prior, if it unfolded without durable material expression, is effectively invisible. This creates a systematic distortion. Periods rich in ephemeral development look empty. Periods marked by durable expression look dense. The contrast exaggerates difference and masks continuity. The past appears punctuated by dramatic turning points when, in reality, it may have been shaped by slow, cumulative adaptation. The effect is particularly pronounced in early history. The deeper we go into the past, the fewer durable materials survive. Organic decay accelerates. Geological processes erase surfaces. Human reuse of materials removes earlier layers. The farther back we look, the more selective the record becomes. As a result, Early development is doubly vulnerable. It is both less likely to be preserved and more likely to be misinterpreted when fragments do survive. This misinterpretation often takes the form of false novelty. When we encounter advanced features without clear predecessors, we assume they are new. We treat them as inventions rather than expressions. We attribute them to moments of insight rather than to long-standing traditions finally made visible. The language we use reflects this bias. We speak of the first city, the first writing, the first civilization, as if these were singular events rather than thresholds crossed at different times in different places. But thresholds are not beginnings. They are points of transition. What lies below them is not absence, but opacity. This opacity invites overconfidence. Because we can date what survives, we trust those dates to define the limits of development. We forget that dating tells us when something became archaeologically visible, not when it became socially meaningful. The distinction is subtle but essential. A society may practice agriculture for generations before adopting storage systems that preserve seeds well enough to leave a trace. It may organize labor effectively long before constructing buildings that fossilize that organization. It may transmit complex knowledge long before encoding it in symbols that endure. When these practices finally intersect with durable forms, they appear fully developed. The preparatory phases remain unseen, and the timeline tightens artificially. This tightening produces the illusion of sudden emergence. Over time, these illusions accumulate. They shape comparative frameworks. They influence which societies are seen as innovators and which are dismissed as stagnant. They encourage narratives in which progress seems to accelerate mysteriously at certain moments. Yet the acceleration may be illusory. What is accelerating is not development itself, but our ability to detect it. This realization has consequences beyond archaeology. It affects how we think about human capacity, creativity, and resilience. If development can proceed extensively without leaving a trace, then the visible record may represent only a fraction of what humanity has achieved. The rest lies beyond recovery. This does not mean that the past was uniformly advanced or that all societies reached similar levels of complexity. It means that complexity took multiple forms, not all of which aligned with preservation. Some paths were legible, others were not. When we privilege the legible, we risk mistaking it for the universal. The danger is not that we underestimate the past, though we often do, but that we misunderstand it. We impose narratives of suddenness where there was continuity, and narratives of simplicity where there was subtlety. The illusion of sudden development is a byproduct of how history survives. Once this is acknowledged, the question changes again. If development can leave no trace, and if timelines compress what survives, then the apparent beginnings of civilization may be nothing more than moments when invisibility ended, briefly and imperfectly, which suggests that what we call origins may be less about creation and more about exposure. And if that is the case, then the earliest visible civilizations may not be the first of their kind. They may simply be the first we are able to see. Much of what we think we know about the past is shaped by a simple fact. Only certain things survive. This fact is so obvious that it is rarely questioned. Ruins remain, artifacts endure, written records persist. From these remnants, we reconstruct history. We assume that what we see represents what mattered most, but this assumption quietly introduces a powerful distortion. In statistics, this distortion is known as survivorship bias, the error of drawing conclusions based only on what remains, while ignoring what has disappeared. In history, the same bias operates, though its effects are less easily recognized. We build narratives from the civilizations that left the strongest traces. We compare their achievements, trace their influence, and place them at the center of human development. Meanwhile, societies that did not survive materially are excluded, not because they were unimportant, but because they are unavailable. Over time, survival becomes mistaken for significance. This bias is especially influential in early history, where the record is thin and uneven. A handful of civilizations dominate our understanding, not because they were the only ones to exist, but because they left behind materials that resisted decay. Their stories become the story. Everything else fades into silence. This creates a misleading impression of continuity and dominance. It appears as though certain paths of development were inevitable, that monument-building societies were destined to prevail, that urbanization was the natural endpoint, that permanence was progress. But this impression is retrospective. We see the winners because they left remains. We do not see the alternatives because they did not. In doing so, we mistake survival for superiority. This bias shapes not only what we remember, but how we interpret what we find. When we encounter a civilization with large-scale architecture, centralized authority, and durable artifacts, we treat it as representative. We measure other societies against it. We label those that differ as incomplete or primitive. Yet the comparison is fundamentally unfair. A society that builds in stone and writes its laws has an inherent advantage in being remembered. A society that organizes itself through oral tradition, flexible structures, and adaptive practices has no such advantage, regardless of its effectiveness or longevity. Over thousands of years, this imbalance compounds. The historical record becomes increasingly skewed toward a narrow range of social forms. Diversity collapses into a few dominant narratives. The illusion of sudden beginnings is reinforced by this process. When we look back and see only civilizations that survived materially, their appearance seems dramatic. They emerge from apparent emptiness, already complex, already organized. But the emptiness may not reflect absence. It may reflect erasure. Countless societies may have existed alongside these visible civilizations, experimenting, adapting, thriving, only to vanish without leaving durable traces. Their absence sharpens the contrast, making the survivors appear exceptional. In reality, they may have been typical. Survivorship bias also affects how we think about innovation. We tend to credit surviving civilizations with originality and leadership. We assume they invented what they practiced. But survival does not guarantee invention. It guarantees preservation. Ideas, techniques, and social forms often spread across cultures. Some groups adopt them and leave traces. Others adopt them and leave none. When only the former survive, they appear as the originators. This misattribution is subtle but consequential. It shapes our sense of chronology. It elevates certain regions and cultures as pioneers while relegating others to obscurity. It reinforces the notion that progress radiated outward from a few centers rather than emerging in multiple places through shared human experimentation. The bias is rarely intentional. It arises from necessity. Historians must work with what survives. Archaeologists excavate what remains. But the conclusions drawn from these remains often exceed what the evidence can support. When we forget about what did not survive, we begin to treat the visible record as complete. We forget that it is a selection, filtered by time, chance, and material durability. This forgetfulness is dangerous. It encourages narratives in which civilization seems rare, fragile, and sudden, something that emerges only under special conditions and only in certain places. It obscures the possibility that complex social organization may have been far more widespread, appearing in forms that history is ill-equipped to recognize. Once survivorship bias is acknowledged, the past looks different. Instead of a few isolated peaks rising from a flat landscape, we begin to imagine a terrain filled with activity, most of it lost. The civilizations we know become points of survival rather than points of origin. They are not necessarily the first. They are the last to remain visible. This reframing does not diminish their achievements. It contextualizes them. It suggests that what we see is not the full spectrum of human possibility, but a narrow slice preserved by circumstance. And once that is accepted, the mystery of sudden beginnings deepens. If we only see what survived, then the apparent emergence of civilization may tell us less about how societies developed and more about which ones happened to leave remains. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If history is written by what endures, how much of humanity's past has already been filtered out before we ever had the chance to ask what it meant? Survivorship bias does more than distort what we remember. It reshapes how we understand time itself. When only certain civilizations remain visible, timelines begin to align around them. Periods are defined by their rise and fall. Progress appears to move from one surviving center to the next, as if history were a relay race passed between a small number of enduring cultures. This creates an illusion of inevitability. The civilizations we know seem destined to emerge. Their structures appear logical, even necessary. Their dominance feels preordained. What survived becomes what should have survived, and alternative paths quietly disappear from consideration. But inevitability is a retrospective construction. At the time, outcomes were uncertain. Societies experimented, some expanded, some adapted quietly. Others collapsed or transformed beyond recognition. Survival was contingent, shaped by environment, chance, and historical coincidence, not by inherent superiority. Yet survivorship bias erases contingency. When we look backward, we see only the outcomes that endured. We forget the vast field of possibilities that once existed alongside them. The past becomes narrower, cleaner, and more linear than it ever was. This narrowing affects how we rank civilizations. Those that left monuments and records are elevated as benchmarks. Their political systems become models. Their technologies become standards. Their social arrangements are treated as milestones. Meanwhile, societies that left little behind are measured against these standards and found wanting. The comparison is flawed. A society optimized for adaptability may leave fewer traces than one optimized for permanence. A society that avoided concentration may appear less complex than one that centralized power. A society that valued balance over expansion may seem less advanced than one that pursued growth relentlessly. But these differences reflect priorities, not capabilities. Survivorship bias turns priorities into judgments. It also influences how we explain change. When a visible civilization declines, we search for causes: environmental stress, internal conflict, external invasion. When an invisible society disappears, we rarely ask the same questions. Its absence feels unremarkable because it left nothing to mourn. As a result, the historical record becomes asymmetrical. Collapse is scrutinized when it affects the visible. It is ignored when it affects the invisible. This asymmetry reinforces the sense that visible civilizations are exceptional, more worthy of attention, more central to the human story. Their sudden appearance seems mysterious. Their disappearance feels tragic. The countless societies that preceded or paralleled them remain abstract, unnamed, and largely unexamined. This has implications for how we interpret origins. When we trace a surviving civilization back to its earliest visible point, we often treat that point as a beginning. We forget that survivorship bias has already filtered out its predecessors, competitors, and alternatives. The visible start is not the start of complexity. It is the start of preservation. Everything before it, including societies that may have contributed ideas, practices, or innovations, is erased from the narrative. This erasure creates false hierarchies. Certain regions appear to lead, others appear to follow or lag behind. The distribution of progress looks uneven, concentrated in a few areas at specific times. But this unevenness may reflect preservation patterns rather than actual development. Regions with climates favorable to preservation appear more historically significant. Regions where materials decay quickly appear less so. The bias becomes geographic as well as cultural. Once this is recognized, the map of early civilization begins to blur. Instead of clear centers and peripheries, we see zones of visibility and invisibility. Instead of linear advancement, we see overlapping trajectories, many of which never intersected with durable media. The civilizations that appear fully formed may not be anomalies. They may be survivors, the few whose choices, environments, or circumstances allowed their traces to endure. Their apparent completeness may reflect not sudden development, but selective memory. This realization does not render history meaningless. It makes it humbler. It reminds us that what we know is partial, that our confidence rests on absence as much as presence, that entire chapters of human experience may have unfolded without leaving a mark we can still read. Survivorship bias does not lie to us outright. It simply tells us only part of the truth and encourages us to mistake that part for the whole. Once this bias is acknowledged, the mystery of sudden beginnings changes again. The question is no longer why civilization appears so abruptly, but why we expect the past to reveal itself fully at all. If survival governs visibility and visibility governs narrative, then the history we tell is shaped less by what happened than by what happened to last. And if that is the case, then the earliest civilizations we recognize may not represent the dawn of complexity. They may represent the point at which complexity finally became difficult to erase. Few words have shaped our understanding of the past more quietly and more destructively than the word primitive. It appears neutral, descriptive, almost technical, yet embedded within it is an entire framework of judgment. To call a society primitive is not merely to describe its tools or materials. It is to position it on a scale, lower, earlier, less developed. This scale feels intuitive because it mirrors modern assumptions about progress. We imagine history as a ladder. Some societies climb faster, others lag behind. Those without writing, cities, or monuments are placed near the bottom, regardless of how effectively they functioned in their own contexts. But this framework collapses under scrutiny. The word primitive implies deficiency, a lack of something presumed essential. Yet what is considered essential is rarely universal. It reflects modern values rather than historical necessity. Writing, for example, is invaluable in certain conditions. In others, it is unnecessary. Monumental architecture can signal power and continuity, but it can also impose rigidity and vulnerability. To label societies without these features as primitive is to confuse difference with inferiority. This confusion is reinforced by visibility. Societies that leave few durable traces are harder to study. Their absence of monuments and texts makes them seem incomplete. We know less about them, and ignorance is easily mistaken for simplicity. Over time, uncertainty hardens into assumption. The irony is that many societies we describe as primitive were extraordinarily refined. They managed resources sustainably for centuries. They navigated complex environments with precision. They maintained social cohesion without centralized authority. They transmitted knowledge across generations without writing. These achievements require intelligence, discipline, and adaptability, qualities rarely acknowledged when material markers are absent. The problem lies not in the past, but in the categories we use to interpret it. Our classifications are shaped by what survives. We rank societies based on their archaeological footprint rather than their lived effectiveness. Those that built in stone appear advanced. Those that did not appear stalled or incomplete. But this ranking reflects preservation bias, not historical reality. Once this bias is recognized, the concept of primitiveness begins to unravel. Technological simplicity does not imply cognitive simplicity. Material lightness does not imply social weakness. Absence of writing does not imply absence of complex thought. These assumptions persist largely because they align with what archaeology can easily document. Yet some of the most complex systems humans have ever created leave minimal physical evidence. Language itself is one example. Spoken language is among humanity's most sophisticated inventions. It enables abstraction, cooperation, and cultural continuity. Yet spoken language leaves no archaeological trace. If writing had never been invented, future observers might struggle to recognize its existence at all. Would that make early societies primitive? The same applies to ethics, law, and cosmology. Moral systems can be deeply elaborated without being codified. Legal principles can be enforced through custom rather than inscription. Cosmological understanding can be embedded in ritual and narrative rather than in texts. These systems shape behavior profoundly, yet they are nearly invisible once the society that practiced them disappears. When we encounter civilizations that appear fully formed, part of the shock comes from contrast. They do not seem to grow out of what we imagine as primitive precursors. The leap feels too great. But this reaction is shaped by our definitions. If we redefine primitiveness as material absence rather than cognitive limitation, the shock diminishes. The gap narrows. The apparent leap becomes a shift in expression rather than a transformation in capacity. This reframing challenges a comforting hierarchy. It suggests that early human societies were not uniformly advancing toward a single endpoint, but exploring a wide range of viable ways to live. Some emphasized permanence. Others emphasized flexibility. Some externalized knowledge. Others embodied it. None of these choices are inherently primitive, yet history remembers them differently. The societies that built for eternity appear dominant. The societies that lived lightly fade away. The word primitive becomes a placeholder for absence rather than an accurate description. This has ethical consequences as well as historical ones. By labeling past societies as primitive, we distance ourselves from them. We treat their ways of living as obsolete rather than adaptive. We miss opportunities to learn from systems that prioritized balance, resilience, and long-term sustainability. In the context of civilizations that appear fully formed, this mislabeling obscures more than it reveals. The problem is not that these civilizations emerged from primitiveness. The problem is that we have misunderstood what came before. If we abandon the assumption that early societies were cognitively or socially rudimentary, the mystery changes shape. What looks like sudden advancement may instead reflect a change in material expression, a decision to build, write, or monumentalize what was already understood. The challenge, then, is not to explain how intelligence appeared so suddenly, but to recognize how deeply intelligence may have existed long before it left traces we can still see. Modern bias does not announce itself loudly. It works quietly, through language, categories, and expectations so familiar that they feel natural. By the time we encounter the past, our interpretations are already framed. The word primitive is one of those frames. It reassures us that history has direction, that there is a clear distinction between then and now, that we stand at a higher point on a long trajectory of improvement. In this narrative, early societies occupy the lower rungs, slowly ascending toward modernity. But this narrative relies on a narrow definition of advancement. It equates progress with accumulation, intelligence with inscription, complexity with permanence. Anything that does not conform to these criteria is treated as incomplete, a stage to be surpassed rather than a system to be understood. This framing influences how we read evidence. When we encounter societies that appear fully formed, we experience cognitive dissonance. They do not fit neatly into the latter. Their sophistication seems disproportionate to their supposed age. The gap between what we expect and what we see becomes uncomfortable. To resolve that discomfort, we often reach for familiar explanations. Perhaps development accelerated. Perhaps knowledge arrived suddenly. Perhaps these societies were exceptional. But these explanations preserve the latter. They protect the idea that civilization must begin from something primitive and move upward in visible stages. What they do not challenge is the ladder itself. Once we let go of that structure, a different picture emerges. Early societies may not have been waiting to become civilized. They may have already been operating at levels of complexity appropriate to their environments and values. Their choices about materials, mobility, memory, and organization reflect strategies, not shortcomings. In this view, the past is not a hierarchy of improvement, but a field of variation. Some societies externalized knowledge early. Others delayed or rejected that move. Some built for permanence. Others built for adaptability. Some centralized authority. Others distributed it. Each path carried trade-offs. The archaeological record privileges certain paths over others. When we mistake privilege for progress, we distort the story. This distortion is reinforced by education and media. Textbooks favor clear sequences. Museums display artifacts that impress visually. Narratives gravitate toward what can be shown, measured, and dated. Subtlety is harder to present. As a result, societies that do not leave striking remains are summarized briefly, if at all. Their complexity is reduced to footnotes. Their innovations are treated as preludes rather than achievements. Over time, this creates a moralized timeline. Later societies are seen as better, not just different. Earlier ones are framed as incomplete rather than alternative. The word primitive becomes a moral judgment disguised as a technical term. This moralization affects how we respond to mystery. When a civilization appears suddenly advanced, we react with surprise because it violates our assumptions about early human capacity. We expect simplicity and find sophistication. The mismatch feels uncanny. But the uncanniness lies not in the past, but in our expectations. If we assume that early societies were capable of complex thought, organization, and adaptation, even without durable material expression, then sudden visibility loses its shock. What changes is not capacity, but expression. The civilization did not become intelligent overnight, it became legible. This reframing also affects how we think about loss. If we believe that early societies were primitive, their disappearance feels less significant. We imagine that little was lost. But if we recognize that many societies may have achieved high levels of sophistication in forms that left no trace, then loss becomes more profound. Entire ways of knowing may have vanished. Entire systems of understanding may have dissolved without record. The silence of the past becomes heavier, not emptier. Letting go of the word primitive forces us to confront this silence honestly. It requires acknowledging that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that material scarcity does not imply intellectual scarcity, that visibility is not value. This acknowledgement does not romanticize the past. It does not claim that all early societies were equally advanced or harmonious. It simply recognizes that complexity is context-dependent. Civilization is not a single invention. It is a pattern that emerges differently under different conditions. When we encounter civilizations that appear fully formed, the temptation is to treat them as anomalies, exceptions to a rule of gradual development. But the rule itself may be flawed. The past may have been filled with complexity long before it chose to express itself in durable ways. And once we accept that possibility, the ladder dissolves. What remains is not a straight line of progress, but a mosaic of human experience, much of it lost, some of it preserved, all of it shaped by choices that time has filtered unevenly. The word primitive obscures that mosaic. Abandoning it does not solve the mystery of sudden beginnings. It deepens it. Because if early societies were not primitive, then what appears to be the birth of civilization may instead be the moment when one particular expression of civilization finally crossed the threshold of permanence. And everything before that moment, however complex, however intelligent, slipped quietly out of view. At this point, the question has shifted. We began by asking why certain civilizations appear fully formed, why they seem to emerge without childhood, without hesitation, without visible preparation. Along the way, that question has slowly unraveled. What now stands in its place is something more difficult. Perhaps these civilizations were never meant to be seen at all. History, as we encounter it, is not a neutral window into the past. It is a selective medium. It shows us what time allowed to remain, not what time was asked to preserve. The civilizations that appear suddenly may not be the first of their kind. They may be the first that crossed into a form legible to deep time. Everything else may have existed outside that legibility. This possibility reframes absence entirely. Instead of treating missing evidence as a failure of discovery, we begin to treat it as a feature of the past itself. Some ways of living do not translate well into ruins. Some forms of intelligence do not harden into artifacts. Some societies may have been structured in ways that deliberately avoided permanence. If so, their disappearance was not an accident. It was an outcome of how they chose to exist. Consider what it means to design a society for adaptability rather than endurance. Such a society would value responsiveness over accumulation, memory over inscription, relationships over structures. It would embed knowledge in practice rather than in objects. It would avoid overinvestment in fixed locations. It would prioritize balance with its environment rather than domination of it. From the perspective of archaeology, this society would be nearly invisible. Its tools would decompose. Its dwellings would erode. Its knowledge would die with its carriers. Even if it thrived for centuries, it would leave little behind to contradict the silence that followed. If civilizations like this existed, and there is no reason to believe they could not have, then much of human history has unfolded beyond our ability to reconstruct it. What we call prehistory may not be a time before civilization, but a time before preservation. In that case, the civilizations we know are not the ancestors of all complexity. They are the survivors of a particular strategy, the strategy of permanence. This strategy has advantages. It allows knowledge to accumulate across generations. It stabilizes authority. It enables large-scale coordination. But it also introduces rigidity. It binds societies to places, institutions, and records that can become liabilities under changing conditions. Other strategies may have been equally successful, perhaps more so in certain environments, but they did not prioritize being remembered. Those societies may have solved problems we still struggle with: sustainability, resilience, long-term balance. Their solutions may have been elegant, efficient, and culturally rich, and they may be gone without trace. This idea is unsettling because it undermines the notion that history naturally reveals its most important chapters. It suggests that significance and survival are not aligned, that what mattered most to human flourishing may not be what lasted longest. It also challenges the assumption that progress moves toward visibility. If some societies chose invisibility, not intentionally but as a consequence of their values, then the absence of their remains does not mark failure. It marks a different relationship with time. From this perspective, the sudden appearance of civilization is no longer mysterious. It is inevitable. The moment a society chooses to externalize its knowledge, build in durable materials, and anchor itself to place, it becomes visible across millennia. That visibility creates the illusion of origin. But origin is not the same as exposure. The civilization appears fully formed because what came before was never designed to survive exposure to deep time. Its foundations were human, not material. Once the people were gone, the civilization went with them. This possibility cannot be proven. There is no excavation that can recover what was never anchored in durable form. There is no method that can reconstruct systems that left no trace. The silence remains silent. But the pattern is suggestive. Across regions and eras, we encounter societies that seem to arrive with knowledge already in hand. Their suddenness is consistent. Their completeness is recurring. The explanation may not lie in extraordinary events, but in ordinary loss. What we see may not be the beginning of civilization, but the moment when civilization chose to leave footprints heavy enough for time to notice. Everything lighter passed through unnoticed. This does not diminish the civilizations we study. It places them within a broader, more uncertain human story, one in which visibility is rare and remembrance is selective. And it forces us to consider a final, uncomfortable thought. If some civilizations were never meant to be seen, then the past we know may be only a fraction of what humanity once was. There is a temptation at the end of any historical inquiry to resolve uncertainty. We want conclusions, we want causes, we want to know what really happened. This impulse is understandable. It gives us closure. It allows us to place the past neatly behind us, explained and contained. But some questions resist closure. The question of why certain civilizations appear fully formed may be one of them. If the argument so far has any force, it suggests that the mystery does not stem from missing ingenuity or unexplained leaps. It stems from the limits of what history can show us. The past is not incomplete because we have failed to uncover it fully. It is incomplete because it was never fully preservable. This distinction matters. It means that no future discovery, no new excavation technique, no refined dating method can fully resolve the problem. We may find earlier sites. We may push timelines back. We may uncover more context, but the core limitation remains. What was never anchored in durable form is beyond recovery. This does not render historical study futile. It renders it modest. It reminds us that history is not a total account, but a partial one, shaped by choices ancient societies made long before we began asking questions. Choices about materials, about memory, about whether to build for the future or live within the present. Those choices determined what could be seen. The civilizations that appear suddenly in our records may have been the ones that crossed a threshold, not of intelligence, but of visibility. They adopted practices that made them legible to deep time. In doing so, they entered history. Others may not have. This realization complicates the idea of origins. We often speak of the first civilization, the first city, the first writing, as if these were absolute beginnings. But perhaps they are better understood as first survivals, the earliest instances of something durable enough to persist. What came before may not have been lesser. It may simply have been lighter. Once this possibility is taken seriously, the narrative of sudden beginnings loses its urgency. The need to explain how civilization appeared so quickly begins to fade. The appearance itself becomes the phenomenon to explain. Why do we see what we see? Why do certain forms of human organization leave deep impressions in time while others vanish almost completely? Why do some societies become legible while others dissolve into anonymity? These questions do not point toward hidden empires or lost golden ages. They point toward something quieter and more unsettling, that the record of human history is not aligned with the full range of human experience. What we know is shaped by survival, not significance. This means that our picture of the past may be systematically skewed toward particular values: permanence, accumulation, control, visibility. Societies that prioritized these values are overrepresented. Societies that did not are underrepresented or absent. The imbalance is not malicious, it is structural, and it leaves us with an uncomfortable inheritance, a history that feels authoritative but is built on silences we cannot fill. In that silence, it is tempting to speculate, to imagine lost civilizations of extraordinary power or forgotten technologies beyond our understanding. But such speculation, while alluring, may miss the more challenging insight. The civilizations we cannot see may not have been extraordinary in a dramatic sense. They may have been ordinary in the deepest sense. Societies that solved the problems of living well within their constraints, without needing to be remembered. Their disappearance does not make them failures. It makes them incompatible with deep time. The civilizations that appear fully formed, then, may not represent sudden creation. They may represent a narrowing, a moment when one strategy among many became visible enough to dominate the historical record. Everything else fell away. This perspective does not ask us to abandon history. It asks us to approach it differently, with restraint rather than certainty, with curiosity rather than conclusion, with an awareness that what we see is not the whole story. Perhaps the most honest response to the mystery of sudden beginnings is not to solve it, but to sit with it, to recognize that the past may be richer than it appears, that civilization may have taken many forms, and that some of those forms passed through time without leaving a shadow long enough for us to find. If that is true, then the civilizations we study are not the beginning of human complexity. They are the point at which complexity became difficult to forget. Everything before that remains unseen, not because it did not exist, but because it was never meant to endure. And that may be the most unsettling conclusion of all.